Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Education Policy Fellowship Program Leadership Fireside Chat Series, designed to lift up voices of our Education Policy Fellowship Program alumni from across the country. I'm Helen Malone, National EPFP Director and Vice President for Research and Innovation in the Institute for Educational Leadership. And today I'm pleased to be with Dr. Devon Brenner, who is our EPFP alum from 2004-2005, and she's also our Mississippi EPFP site coordinator. In addition, she is Assistant Vice President for Outreach and Initiatives at the Office of Research and Economic Development, Interim Director of Social Science Research Center, and Professor, all in Mississippi State University. So we're pleased to have her with us today and learn about her leadership journey and the impact the EPFP has had on her, as well as learn about her research and scholarship. A little bit about IEL. IEL was founded in 1964, and our mission is to partner with under-resourced communities to equip leaders to better prepare children, youth, adults, and families for post-secondary education and train in rewarding careers and civic and community engagement. And a bit about EPFP, which helped to found IEL, and we are now in our 58th year. It's a nationally recognized fellowship program that engages a diverse and collaborative community of strategic leaders to promote equitable education policy. EPFP builds capacity of fellows across policy, leadership, and networking, and is designed to be a cross-sector, cross-role, and cross-system. And we have graduated over 10,000 alumni across the country, and we're so proud to be here today with Devon to learn about her work. To learn more about us, please follow us at EPFP_IEL and at IEL Connects. You can also learn more about the Institute for Educational Leadership at IEL.org. And to see this episode and other episodes in our alumni Fireside Chat series, please go to our YouTube channel under the Institute for Educational Leadership. So with that, I'm going to move us into a conversation. So welcome, Devon, and thank you so much for your time. So let's kick right in and dive right into the conversation and tell us about your professional journey and about your current work.
So you rattled off a long list of titles that I have here at Mississippi State University. I came to Mississippi State in 1999 at the end of my PhD program. I did my PhD in teacher education at Michigan State University and came down to Mississippi, did not know how much I would like it here. Did not know I would stay here for my entire career, but now I'm fully enmeshed in Starkville, Mississippi with my children, my grandchild, and my mother all living within a half a mile of me here at Starkville, Mississippi. So really has turned out to be a great move for me. I grew up in Michigan, taught fourth grade in Michigan in the small rural high school that I attended, or I taught elementary school in the school district where I went to high school in a small town in Mississippi. There were 89 in my graduating class, and then and got to go back and teach there after I graduated and taught for 3 years and then entered the PhD program. And now here at Mississippi State, I had a career in the teacher education department, helping prepare future elementary teachers to teach reading and writing. Long about 10 years into that work, I served as department head for a little while. I had a 1-year opportunity to work in Washington, D.C. as an education fellow in the office of our state senator, Senator Thad Cochran, where I learned so much about federal policy making. And then I came back and joined the Office of Research and Economic Development. And I don't know, what else about that is helpful?
No, that's a great start. So yeah, tell us a little bit about who sparked your professional journey that led you to where you are today.
So many people. I think I would probably go with 3 or 4 people who have really sparked my professional journey. And one of them is my department head when I first became a new faculty member, who immediately sort of started giving me small positions of leadership in the department and gave me an opportunity to really learned the work of being a young professor and a scholar. And then along the way, I was mentored by two of my two colleagues in the field. One of them had been my dissertation chair, Dr. David Pearson, who does elementary literacy work around the teaching, a well-known scholar in the teaching of reading and writing. And he was such an amazing mentor to me as a doc student and a young faculty member, but also Dr. Elfrida Hebert, who works promoting, helping kids become fluent and able readers. And she and I collaborated on a ton of research projects. And for a while we were just like, did little things like she invited me to be in a writing group where we would just report on each other's writing goals and whether we had written for 15 minutes every day. And during a time when I was a junior faculty member, struggling to balance all of the various parts of my roles, it was really helpful to have somebody that cared about their opinion of me to check in with me and say, you know, how are you doing on these important parts of your work? And then both of them were super generous in setting me up with connections and networks and opportunities that really helped me grow. So grateful to them. And that is the kind of work I've tried to continue to do to help my colleagues, to help create opportunities for my younger colleagues here at Mississippi State University so that they have the same sort of opportunities to build a bigger network and to write or to get connected to the kinds of work that they want to do. And that's one of my very favorite things to be able to do. In the Office of Research, my role is basically to help faculty members succeed, particularly in their scholarship. And a lot of times that really just means playing the role of matchmaker and just saying, you're interested in hunger issues and you are in the Department of Sociology. And I happen to know that over here in the department, in a different college, in the Department of Ag Econ, there are also people who are interested in hunger issues. And here's an introduction, happy collaborating. And that is just like such a delight to be able to stand back and have that wider perspective and help connect people in those ways. And I could keep talking, so many people. Our university's vice president for research, he was the one who helped me get the opportunity in Washington, D.C. to work there. I had met some of our congressional delegation when they came to campus were interested in what was happening in education on campus. And so as department head, I had interacted with them a couple of times, and they wanted somebody during the transition from No Child Left Behind to ESSA. They were interested in having somebody with an education background in their office. And they invited me to come, and he wholeheartedly supported that. And that's kind of what led to that amazing opportunity to go live and work in DC for a year.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like your journey is filled with mentors and supporters and cheerleaders along the way.
Yeah, for sure.
So to kind of shift then into EPFP, how did the fellowship pillars of policy leadership and networking inform your professional journey?
So I'm going to go, like, to answer this question, I'm kind of going to go way back and tell a story about me in my undergrad days, and I'll get there eventually. So bear with me for a second. But when I was a senior in college, I was super interested in issues of equity and social justice. And it was the late 1990s. America was doing questionable things in Central America. And I was kind of interested in trying to shift the national conversation around some of these things that I thought were unfair. And so my major, my senior year, was some vague interdisciplinary studies with Spanish and history and communication. And I was going to go to Central America and I was going to fight for social justice. And I wrote an essay that last half of my senior year where I was like, I think the world should be a more equitable place. And this is why I've chosen this major. But really, and then as I wrote the essay, I realized, but really grownups, it's hard to shift grownups because they're already set in their ways. And really, maybe it's better to work with kids. And so like I changed my major and spent 2 more years in college to become an elementary ed person. And then I started teaching, and it was sort of the same thing. Like, yeah, I'm kind of like helping think about issues of fairness with fourth graders, 25 kids at a time, but maybe I can make a bigger impact if I back up and work with future teachers and help them kind of bring a social justice stance to their work as educators. So then I decided I need to go get a PhD and learn how to teach teachers. And so this sort of commitment to issues of equity and making the world a better place have long been a part of my work. And during my doctoral program, my PhD is technically in teacher education. What is it? I don't know, but policy is in the name of it. And I was interested in policy all along. And when I came to Mississippi State, I was engaged in statewide conversations around the teaching of reading and writing, and got to help right around this same era that I did the EPFP program. I also got to help work on our state laws around the requirements for elementary ed majors, and engage with some large philanthropists and state policymakers around what should be the rules and how do we help teachers be better prepared to teach reading and writing in a state where literacy rates are kind of low. And at that very moment, I got invited to apply for the EPFP program. My amazing department head helped fund my participation in EPFP. And I spent that year learning more about the state policy making system and networking with folks from nonprofits and folks from other education programs and folks in K-12. And I was a brand new baby professor, and I was just learning about the state of Mississippi and how things work here and the biggest needs and the biggest strengths. And so participating in EPFP right at that moment, where I was also being asked to think about teacher education requirements and state policy and education, fit right in with all of my commitments that I had as a professional and as a human. And so it was a really wonderful opportunity that came right at the right time.
How have you applied what you learned in EPFP, and how do you apply today?
Yeah. So I think those three pillars for me of networking, leadership, and policy, they're really three faces of the same thing. So, I see networking and help, like I said earlier, helping connect people with the people who are doing work, similar work, or shared interests, or shared commitments, or new interests who can help shape your work. Like that kind of networking is a really important part of my leadership work. And that to engage in policy, you also have to have the characteristics of a leader in terms of being able to influence people, or really, I think leadership, a lot of leadership is about sort of listening to people and understanding what they need and helping them achieve their goals, and maybe helping shift their goals to things that are attainable, or shift their goals to things that will help them grow or help them know what new opportunities are. And I feel like advocacy kind of shares those same characteristics, where it's around listening to policymakers and figuring out what they care about, and then helping connect your goals to their goals, or building those relationships. And so they're all faces of the same kind of work, and they very much intertwine and overlap. And so I love that those are the three pillars for EPFP, because you can't have one without the other two.
Great. So can you share, because now you have stepped into a role of your Mississippi EPFP coordinator.
Yes.
So what have you taken from your own experience, and how have you applied as a coordinator? And what do you tell fellows in terms of their experience and piece of advice that you share with them?
When I look back at my EPFP program, like I said, the networking piece of it was so important. So I've tried to do that both in terms of how we recruit into the EPFP program. And we always end up having a nice mix of folks from K-12, folks from higher ed, folks from nonprofit organizations. So folks who are doing different kinds of work. And I think one of the really powerful things about our Mississippi EPFP and most of them is that we bring people together who often don't work together, who often kind of work in their separate silos or their separate fields, and learning from one another is such a huge piece of it. And so try to make a lot of time for people just to share their work and their concerns and their interests and their goals, and how what they're learning applies to them in their different roles, so that they can learn from one another and stay connected afterwards. So that's a piece that I've tried to carry over. Another piece I think I have learned is one of my most important lessons for policymaking is to try to figure out who are the right decision makers to try to influence. And that, there's lots of ways to frame that, but I call it the different levels, whether it's a law or it's a funding or it's a regulation that the departments are actually doing, or it's a local implementation decision, or a state or federal or local or a school board or an administrator. So, and I think that's something that gets really challenging for folks to figure out until you really start to dig into it and figure out, well, no, I don't need to call my senator to talk about issues of teacher licensure, because they don't have anything to do with teacher licensure. And so it's really the licensure commission. And I think that kind of work of figuring out who are the right decision makers to think with this about, and that so many things are like, there's this overarching goal of testing, but if you're really worried about schools spending too much time preparing for the test, those are really local decisions. And that can be really hard from the outside, and that work of figuring out who are the right decision makers and how do I influence them? How do I partner with them? I think is one of the big lessons I learned in my year as a fellow that I try to carry over into our fellowship program.
That's wonderful to hear. And I'm curious for you then, what are this sort of one, lesson that not only you kind of give fellows, but you think that they really take to heart the most? I'm doing a presentation next week about our state EPFP program. And so I was just asking, and I've got 3 alumni that are presenting with me, and I was just asking them what was one of their big takeaways. And they said there were 2 and so far. And one of them is that a lot of the work of advocacy is around relationships and building relationships and being a trustworthy person in your relationship with decision makers. And I think that's one of the basic levels of advocacy, is that, and it's kind of, it can be tricky for some of us who might on the surface share very different values than some of our policymakers seem to share based on how they vote, is to figure out how to build relationships with people who might otherwise seem to be very different from you. So relationships, I think, are one of the big keys to advocacy. And the other one is like sort of cheesy, but it's complicated. And I think anytime it's sort of on the surface, like teacher shortages or school funding, like this is what we should do. But then the more you sort of unpeel, we have one fellow this year who's interested in sort of what she calls it instructional seat time. And she was thinking, I need to help change the state rules around the length of the school day, because kids are here for too long and they ride the bus for 40, it's a rural county, they ride the bus for 45 minutes. They're getting on the bus some kids are getting on the bus at 5:50 in the morning, and they don't get home until almost 5 o'clock at night because the school day is so long and then their bus ride is so long. And she's like, how do we change that? And she was like, well, I just need to change this rule. And it turns out that it's not really a rule. It's more of an implementation decision that has to do with how the state's school improvement programs have been implemented to provide an additional. And so she's really learning, like, it's a nuanced thing that is this amalgamation of a particular rule and how it gets interpreted by the department and how it gets interpreted at the local level and the decisions school board made, how one thing gets layered on top of another, on top of another. And now all of a sudden kids are getting on the bus at 5:50 in the morning.
And it also has to do with the fact that we don't have enough buses and we need to buy some more, and so that the bus routes could be shorter. And so so I think this it's complicated, and then like figuring out what exactly you're asking for or what exactly you think needs to be different. It's so easy for sort of armchair politicians, armchair folks to feel like we know exactly what needs to be done. But when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I appreciate that example. It's a very timely example here across the country.
Yeah.
So to shift gears now from EPFP to your day job, I suppose.
Sure.
So you run the Rural Teacher Persistence and Retention Program in collaboration with 14 rural serving institutions funded by NSF. So can you tell us a little bit about your research, this project, and kind of beyond in terms of your scholarship on the rural education?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. We Mississippi is an incredibly rural state. And I probably didn't even appreciate that until I got here 20 years ago, but more than half of our students attend a rural school, and all but I think 14 of our school districts are classified as rural by the US Department of Education. And so over the last 10 years, I've really been thinking about what does it mean to be a school in a rural community, a rural serving institution of higher education, and learning more and more about rural education and how a strength, like thinking about the strengths of rural communities and the unique needs of rural schools can really be helpful in terms of helping those schools meet the needs of students and families. And so in particular, rural communities have challenging teacher shortages, partly because there's just fewer people to grow up and become a teacher, partly because people from more urban and suburban areas where our institutions of higher learning are mostly located often don't choose to go work in a rural place. So there's the grand narrative in the media that rural places are like flyover states, or they're backwards or they're foolish. And you think of places like, shows like Ozark or Honey Boo Boo or Duck Dynasty that really portray rural places in negative ways. So we get this message that rural places are foolish and backwards and not worth going to. And so I've been interested in my work in challenging those stereotypes and thinking about how do we address teacher shortages in rural places. And recently got funding from the National Science Foundation to collaborate with 14 other rural serving institutions in Texas and in North Carolina and in Kentucky and in Wisconsin and in Kansas and in New York, to look at what are people doing in teacher education around rurality. Do they have rural focused scholarships? If you go teach somewhere rural, we'll give you a loan forgiveness. Do they have field experiences in rural communities so that teachers can know kind of what to expect? Do they address it in their coursework in terms of reading and writing? And over the next 4 years, we'll be sort of looking at those features of educator preparation programs and seeing, are those associated with their graduates choosing to teach in a rural place for their first job and then staying there for the next couple of years? Because I think my theory is, if we are explicit about the pros and cons and real challenges of teaching in a rural place, or we say, yeah, if you go teach in a rural place, you probably won't just teach physics all day. You'll probably end up teaching physics and math and maybe chemistry because you're the only STEM person in the whole darn tiny little high school out on the prairie in Kansas. And so we need to prepare you with those licenses so that you're able to do that work. And so we're going to look at what are we doing and then how are those associated with teacher persistence and retention over the 4 years. And it's a really interesting project. We're just getting started, but it's part of a larger agenda around thinking about what can we do in teacher education and what can we do in higher education in general to help people prepare for careers and return to their communities where they're from, or to choose to go to a rural place and then help those communities thrive and grow.
That sounds really important and exciting. So we'll have to.
It's really fun.
That's great. So the other pieces that you have co-authored a book from our college, Teaching in Rural Places, Thriving Community Schools and Communities, Classroom Schools and Communities, pardon me.
Yep.
The book underscores the importance of teaching in rural schools, as you just mentioned, but also as an act of social justice What would you like to see in education policy pertaining to rural education and discourse on rural communities?
I think in conversations about, I think for many decades, we have been better in the large field of education. We're starting to really recognize the unique needs of urban schools. And there's been a lot of conversations about the challenges and the strengths of urban schools, and less so conversations about rural places. And so, but I think over the last 5 years, we're starting to see a shift in that, and more people are thinking about rural places. And but there still are sort of these dominant myths that rural places are mostly white, and that they're mostly conservative, and that in some circles that they're not really deserving of our attention as scholars, because maybe they vote conservative, or they don't need our help, or they're not worthy of help. And none of those myths are true. Rural places are increasingly diverse in terms of Indigenous, Latinx, and in the South, especially African-American communities, and that the assumption that they're all sort of white and conservative is really not true. And then increasingly important to recognize that even though a lot of red states, which are often very rural, seem monolithic, in fact, there are people doing incredible good work around voter registration, and that supporting and lifting up that work of helping shift those states towards more just and equitable policies is really important. And if we dismiss those states and those communities and don't engage with them, we can't support the people doing the work in those communities and help lift them up. And so the larger focus, I think, on rural places is incredibly important if we want to shift the tone of conversation and help the people who share our commitments in those communities to keep doing their work. Yeah, so it's definitely for me an issue of equity and social justice, and it's definitely for me an issue of and schools are often at the heart of those communities. So in very small schools, sometimes it's very small communities, the school is often the largest employer, and a huge social network, and a huge social and economic driver. And so engaging with schools is one way to support helping those communities thrive. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you sharing about your book, and we have highlighted for those of you watching on our EPFP at IEL.org website in terms of our upcoming books and books that will be published by alumni. Well, thank you so much for your time. So appreciate getting to learn about your professional journey, your EPFP experience, and what you kind of pass on to the next generation of fellows, and just learning a little bit about your work. So I'm so appreciative of your time, and also your partnership
Sure.
in the EPFP community. And for those of you who are have joined this channel and watch this episode, we encourage you to check out more Leadership Fireside Chats with our Education Policy Fellowship Program alumni from across decades and states, and life experiences and roles and positions within the education sector and beyond. So check out our YouTube channel and search us under the Institute for Educational Leadership. So with that, well, thank you so much for your time, and to all of you watching, we hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks so much.
Thank you.